There is a case in my old tin dispatch box that I have never once thought to publish, or rather, that I was asked never to publish, by the one man whose wishes in such matters I have always honoured, and I have decided at last that this is precisely the reason I may set it down now for myself alone, with no thought of the printer. It contains no theft, no cipher, no body upon a hearthrug, no threatening note pushed under a door in the small hours. It contains, in fact, nothing that a reader of the Strand would recognise as a case at all. I learned of it only long afterward, from Holmes himself, on an ordinary evening by our own fire, when the wind was working at the chimney and neither of us had spoken for the better part of an hour. And even then he told it to me almost by accident, the way a man will sometimes let slip the one thing he has guarded most carefully, simply because the room is warm and the danger has passed. It is the story of a winter he spent doing nothing whatsoever, high above a valley in the Alps, in the long strange months when all of England believed him dead, and it is, I think, the only adventure of his I have ever wished to keep for myself. So let me take you there now, to a place I never saw with my own eyes, on an evening in the last days of that first winter after Reichenbach, with the light already going out of the sky. The lamps were coming on in the valley below, one at a time, far down where the town of Davos lay folded into the dark blue of the early evening, and from the high shelf of the sanatorium a man could watch them wake, small and yellow, spreading along the invisible line of the single street, as though someone patient were going from house to house with a taper. Holmes stood at the tall window of his room on the second floor and watched them do it. He had arrived only that afternoon, brought up the last stretch of road by a sledge whose bells he had found frankly excessive, and he had not yet unpacked the smaller of his two bags. There seemed to be no reason to hurry. There seemed, he was beginning to understand with a faint and specific alarm, to be no reason to hurry about anything at all here, ever. And that was a condition he had not encountered in some years and did not immediately know what to do with. The cold came off the window glass in a slow, clean sheet. It was a different cold from the London kind. He noticed the difference at once, the way one notices a stranger has entered a room. London's cold was damp, and it carried things, coal smoke and river, and the sourness of 10,000 chimneys, and it settled into the bones as a kind of argument. This cold argued about nothing. It was simply enormously present, thin and bright and without a single opinion, and when he breathed against the pane his own breath bloomed there in a small grey flower, and then was gone, and he found he could see it plainly even here, indoors, in a heated room. He watched it appear and vanish several times, mildly interested, the way a man newly deprived of his life's work will grow interested in almost anything. He was not ill. This was the first thing that must be understood, and it was the thing the sanatorium staff seemed least able to believe. He had presented himself 2 hours earlier at the office of the establishment, under a name that was not his own, a name he had grown rather fond of over the preceding weeks, and the physician on duty, a courteous, unhurried Swiss with spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, and a way of listening that Holmes rather admired against his will, had asked a number of gentle questions about the chest, the appetite, the nights, and had written nothing down because there was nothing to write. There was no shadow on the lung. There was no fever creeping up at 4 in the afternoon. There was a tall, spare, grey-eyed Englishman of extraordinary tension, who had come a very great distance to lie still, and who plainly had not the smallest idea how the thing was done. "You are tired," the physician had said at last, not as a diagnosis, but as a simple observation, folding his hands, and Holmes had been on the point of denying it with some heat when he realised, rather to his surprise, that it was true. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last several months, though the last several months had certainly not helped. He was tired in the way a bridge is tired, from having borne a great weight for a very long time, and having been designed, foolishly, to believe that this was the whole purpose of a bridge, and that it must never, under any circumstances, be permitted to rest. "A season here," the physician had gone on, "and no correspondence to speak of, and no problems to solve. You will find the second part harder than the first." And he had smiled, and Holmes had understood that he had been seen through completely, and had disliked the sensation, and had also, this was the part he did not mention to me for years, felt something in him unclench, very slightly, at being for once the one who was read rather than the one who read. Now, at the window, He turned the physician's phrase over. No problems to solve. It sat in the mind like a locked drawer to which one has been forbidden the key, and he was aware, with the clarity of a man watching his own weather, of the exact impulse it produced. To find a problem, to manufacture one, to look about this bare, pleasant room and its bare, pleasant view, and locate at once the small wrongness that would let him begin. And of course there was one. There is always one. The habit did not switch off merely because a man had climbed a mountain to be rid of it. It was the sledge driver, as it happened, who had provided the first small wrongness of the day, though it had taken Holmes until now, standing at the window with the light failing, to let himself notice that he had noticed it. The man had worn a wedding ring on the wrong hand and a mourning band that was 3 winters old at least, judging by the wear, and had spoken of my wife twice on the drive up in the easy present tense of a man for whom she was very much alive, and the two facts did not sit together, and somewhere in the long climb Holmes's mind had quietly assembled the small tender explanation. A second marriage, a first grief carried openly and without shame, the band kept not out of sorrow now but out of a promise, and had presented it to him complete, uninvited, like a cat depositing a mouse upon the counterpane. He caught himself doing it. That was the new thing. In London he would not have caught himself. The deduction and the man would have been one and the same, seamless, and he would no more have thought about the machinery than a fish thinks about water. Here, in the thin, bright air, with nothing else to occupy the great engine, he could feel it turn. He could feel himself do it. And for the first time in his life he found the sensation faintly, obscurely embarrassing, like coming upon oneself talking aloud in an empty room, and stopping and looking round to be sure no one has heard. That, he said to the empty room and to the small grey flower of his own breath, will have to be broken of. He did not, of course, believe for one moment that it could be. Below the valley had gone fully to the blue of deep dusk now, that particular Alpine blue that is not quite any colour a London evening ever manages, a blue with snow still faintly luminous inside it, holding the last of the light long after the sky above the peaks had let it go. The lamps of the town were all lit at last, a scattered handful of them, and above the town, on the black shoulders of the mountains, there was nothing at all. No lamp, no glow, no smallest human spark, only the great cold shapes he did not yet know the names of, standing where they had stood for a very long time, and would go on standing after every lamp in the valley had been forgotten. He found this thought unexpectedly, not desolate, but restful. It asked nothing of him. It did not require to be solved. There was a sound behind him, at this point, of the most trivial and domestic kind, a knock, and then the door opening a careful few inches, and the face of the woman who managed the household side of the establishment, appearing in the gap with the particular expression of a person about to explain the rules to someone she has already privately decided will be difficult. Her name, he would learn, was Frau Brenner, and she ran the sanatorium's daily life the way a good sergeant runs a barracks, which is to say, invisibly, thoroughly, and with a total and unshakable conviction that the officers would ruin the place inside a week if left to themselves. "You have not unpacked," she said. It was not a question. She had a way of stating the facts of a situation that removed from the other party any dignified means of disagreeing. "I was watching the lamps," said Holmes. Frau Brenner considered this. She came a step into the room, took in the single opened bag, the untouched bed, the man standing at the window in his travelling coat with the air of one who has arrived somewhere by mistake, and appeared to file it all away under a heading she had used many times before. "The English always watch the lamps," she said, with the resignation of a woman confirming a diagnosis she had feared. The first night, every one of them, at the window, watching the lamps as though the lamps were doing something. She crossed to the bed, twitched the coverlet a quarter of an inch into a straightness Holmes could not have detected with instruments, and stood back satisfied. "Supper is at 7, it is milk, and it is bread, and I will tell you now, so that you do not ask tomorrow as they all ask tomorrow, that it will be milk and bread again in the morning, and that this is not a poverty of the kitchen but a principle of the cure, and that Dr. Baumann will be very pleased with you if you do not have opinions about it." "I shall try," said Holmes gravely, "to have no opinions about the bread." She gave him a long look, the look of a woman who has heard exactly that promise from exactly that sort of Englishman, and has watched it fail before the week was out. "You will have opinions about the bread," she said, "by Thursday." And she went out, and the door closed with a soft, competent click, and Holmes discovered that he was, for the first time in what felt like a great while, very nearly smiling. He turned back to the window. The blue had deepened another shade. Somewhere below a dog barked twice and stopped, and the sound travelled up the still cold air with a clarity that would have taken it half a mile in London and carried it a full valley's width here, arriving thin and perfect and complete. He thought about that, about how sound behaved in this air, how the thinness of it that made a man breathless on the stairs also made the world audible in a way it never was at sea level. And he was aware of the machine beginning to turn again, ready to build something out of it, some system, some little science of Alpine acoustics that would fill an idle hour and then a fuller one. He let it turn a moment. Then, with a deliberate effort that cost him more than he would have admitted, he let it go. This was to be the work of the season, he understood, standing there. Not the milk and not the bread and not the balcony and not the mountain air, though the physician would speak of all of these as though they were the treatment. The treatment was this single act, endlessly repeated. The noticing of the engine as it started and the setting down of it, gently, before it could gather speed. The way one might set down a fine and valuable instrument that one has been carrying for so long and so far that the hand has cramped around it and forgotten how to open. He was not sure he knew how to open the hand. He was not sure the hand would remember, even here, even with all the time in the world and a valley full of blue dusk and no case, no client, no crime, and no earthly reason to do anything at all but stand at a window and watch the lamps come on. But he thought he might, over the coming weeks, learn. The dog did not bark again. The last of the true light went out of the snow below, so gradually that he could not have named the moment, and the valley became simply a darkness with lamps in it, and the peaks became a deeper darkness with stars beginning above them, and the cold came off the glass in its clean sheet, and Holmes stood in his travelling coat in an unfamiliar room, a very long way from Baker Street, and did not solve a single thing. At 7 there would be milk and bread and a low room full of strangers he would be forbidden by his own new discipline to deduce. At 7 in the morning the shutters would be opened, and the same milk and the same bread. And then the long strange business of the cure itself, hours of lying still and wrapped and watching light move across snow, doing nothing, being nobody, a man with no name that was his own, and no problem that was his to solve. He didn't yet know about the choffs. He did not yet know about the old Austrian who fed them, or the small tender thing he would come to understand about that man, and would decide, in the end and against every instinct of his life, to leave beautifully alone. All of that was still ahead of him, folded into the winter like the lamps had been folded into the dusk, waiting to be lit one at a time. For now there was only this, the window, the cold, the valley going dark, and a tired man beginning, clumsily, unwillingly, and without the smallest idea that it had already started, to rest. He unpacked the smaller bag. It did not take long, and when the bell rang somewhere below for supper, a small mild sound in the great stillness of the mountain evening, he found that he had been standing at the window for an hour, without once reaching for anything to do, and that the discovery did not alarm him quite so much as it would have done that afternoon. He went down to the milk and the bread. The shutters opened at 7. This was the first fixed point of the day, the pin upon which everything else was hung, and Holmes came to know its exact character within his first week, the particular rattle and give of the wooden slats being folded back by an attendant in the corridor, the grey light that was not yet light coming into the room in a flat sheet, and then, a moment behind it, the cold, for the window was always cracked an inch through the night, on principle, the same principle that governed the bread, and the air that had been building all night in that inch came in at 7 o'clock like water finding a lower place. It was a hard, mineral morning cold, quite unlike the blue cold of the evenings, and it smelt of nothing at all, which he found he'd begun to look forward to, a man who had spent his life in a city where the air always smelt of something, and usually of something one would rather it did not. He learned the shape of the days the way a prisoner learns the shape of a cell, except that the prisoner wishes to be elsewhere, and Holmes, to his continuing surprise, discovered after a fortnight that he did not. The milk came first, warm, in a heavy white cup, with black bread cut thick and a little hard butter, and the milk was very good, and the bread was, as Frau Brenner had promised, an occasion for opinions. He held out against them until the Wednesday of his first week, and then, precisely on schedule, began to have views about the crust, which he had the grace not to voice, and which she detected in his face across the dining room in any case, and acknowledged with a single satisfied lift of one eyebrow, as a woman marking a horse that has run exactly to form. After the milk and the bread came the cure itself, and it was the cure that undid him gently over the course of that first month, as a hard knot is undone not by force, but by patient working. The cure was this. A man was wrapped, there is no other word for it, in blankets, upon a long reclining chair of wood and canvas, and carried out, or rather walked out under his own power while pretending it was not an indignity, onto the great south-facing balcony that ran the length of the building's second floor and looked out over the whole width of the valley toward the mountains opposite. And there he lay. That was the entire prescription. He lay, wrapped to the chin, upon his long chair, in the open air, in the cold for hours, and he did nothing. He did not read in the first weeks. Reading was permitted only later, once a man had proved he could lie still without it. He did not write, he did not talk beyond the smallest necessities, and even those were frowned upon, for the balcony had its etiquette, and its etiquette was silence. He lay, and he watched the light move across the snow, and that was all, and it was meant to be all, and Dr. Baumann came out twice a day in his spectacles to observe the rows of wrapped and reclining Englishmen and Austrians, and one melancholy Russian, with the mild satisfaction of a gardener walking his beds. Holmes had assumed, in his first days, that he would find this intolerable, and had been rather looking forward to being proved right, for there is a certain pleasure in a confirmed low. Opinion? He was denied it. What he found instead was that the great south balcony, in the full white glare of a mountain morning, was a place where the mind could not easily hold on to its usual furniture. The light was too large. It came off the snowfields opposite in a flood, a clean and enormous brightness that had nothing in it to catch upon. No smoke, no dome, no far grey line of roofs, only the white slopes and the black rock above them, and the hard blue of the sky doing its slow business overhead. And against all that space a man's small hoarded problems, the ones he had carried up the mountain in his chest like contraband, began after an hour or two to seem faintly ridiculous, the way one's furious letter of the night before seems ridiculous when read again over breakfast. He timed the light at first because he could not help himself. He noted where the shadow of the eastern peak fell across the valley floor at 9 and where it had withdrawn to by 11, and he began, in the privacy of his own head, to construct a species of sundial out of the whole mountain range, by which a man lying on the balcony might tell the hour to within 10 minutes from the shadows alone. It was a perfectly useless accomplishment, and he pursued it for 3 days with the concentrated devotion of a scholar, and then one morning, lying wrapped upon his chair with the light coming up the valley toward him, he simply forgot to check. The shadow reached the mark he had set and passed it, and he did not notice, and when he realized some while later that he had not noticed, he lay very still, and considered this development with something close to awe. He had let a measurable thing go by unmeasured. He was not at all sure he had ever done such a thing before in his adult life. Weather was the great business of the balcony, the one permitted subject, and the weather here did not sulk and equivocate for weeks on end, as London's did, but changed its whole nature from hour to hour, dramatically and without apology, so that a man lying still all morning saw more sky in a day than a Londoner saw in a season. There were mornings of hard, faceted blue, the air so clear that the far peaks looked close enough to touch, and each individual pine on the opposite slope stood out black and separate, and on such mornings the cold had an edge to it that made the wrapped figures on the balcony seem, Holmes thought, like a row of very serious cocoons, waiting on some transformation that the management had guaranteed but not scheduled. There were mornings when the cloud came down and sat upon the valley like a lid, and the mountains vanished entirely, and the world shrank to the balcony rail, and the white nothing beyond it. And these mornings the other patients disliked, and Holmes came rather to prize, for the smallness of the visible world matched something he was trying to achieve inside his own skull. And there was one memorable forenoon in his third week, a fall of snow so fine and so windless that it did not seem to fall at all but simply to appear, thickening the air by slow degrees, settling on the blankets of the wrapped and motionless patients until the whole balcony was dusted white and no one moved to brush it off, because to brush it off would have been to do something, and doing something was against the rules. It was this last morning that gave him his first real taste of the balcony's social order, which was a subject of endless muffled fascination to a man forbidden to investigate anything more serious. For the great south balcony, silent as it was not without its politics. There was, first and immovably, the question of position. The best places were at the centre of the balcony's run, where the building's own bulk cut the wind and the sun lingered longest, and these places were held, there is no other word, by seniority, which at a sanatorium meant not age but tenure, the length of a patient's residence, so that a man who had been coughing gently on this mountain for 4 winters outranked entirely a man who had been coughing there for 2, regardless of any other distinction the world might recognise. Holmes, arriving in December to a place where several of the company had wintered there for the better part of a decade, found himself allotted a chair near the eastern end in the full morning glare, but exposed to any wind that chose to come round the corner, and understood without being told that he would remain there until enough of his betters had either recovered or died to move him up the line. He found this system, on reflection, entirely admirable. It was arbitrary, it was rigid, it rewarded nothing but persistence, and it was enforced by no authority whatever except the unanimous and unspoken agreement of every person subject to it, which made it, he reflected, very like nearly every other arrangement by which human beings had ever ordered themselves, only more honest about it. Within this order there were personages. There was an Englishman of florid complexion, an enormous conviction named Colonel Harrowbone, who had wintered at Davos for 6 seasons, and considered himself, in consequence, its senior statesman, and who breached the balcony's rule of silence perhaps 20 times a morning, with observations delivered in a carrying whisper that was far more disruptive than ordinary speech would have been. Remarks upon the weather, chiefly of which he considered himself a great judge, and which he was almost always wrong about, predicting cloud on the clearest mornings and clear skies into the teeth of an advancing storm, with a confidence entirely unshaken by 6 years of contrary evidence. There were the 2 Miss Fanshaws, sisters, who had come out ostensibly for the elder's chest, but in truth, everyone understood, for the general improvement of 2 unmarried ladies' prospects, there being at Davos a permanent modest surplus of solvent gentlemen with weak lungs and time on their hands. There was a young German philosopher who took the cure with a ferocious seriousness, lying more still than anyone, breathing more deeply than anyone, plainly determined to outrest the entire balcony, and win at convalescence as he had presumably won at everything else. And there was the melancholy Russian, who spoke to no one, and wept sometimes, silently, watching the mountains, and whom everyone had the great tact to leave entirely alone, which was, Holmes came to think, the single kindest thing he saw done on that balcony all winter. He watched them all, of course. He could no more have stopped watching them than he could have stopped his own heart, and in the first weeks he watched them with the full apparatus, reading the Colonel's finances off his boot repairs, and the elder Miss Fanshaw's disappointments off the set of her mouth, and the young philosopher's whole anxious history off the particular violence with which he pursued relaxation. But something was happening to the watching, and it took him some time to identify what. In London the reading and the caring had been the same act. He read a man in order to use what he read, and the pleasure and the purpose were one. Here there was nothing to use it for. He read the Colonel, and there was no case the Colonel figured in, no crime the Miss Fanshaws might have witnessed, no thread running from the melancholy Russian to any question Holmes was being paid or was burning to answer. The deductions arrived, complete and correct and beautifully made, and then simply sat there, with nowhere to go, like invitations to a party that had been cancelled, and one morning, lying on his chair in the eastern glare with the Colonel whispering some confident nonsense about an approaching thaw, Holmes realised that he had stopped, several days before, without noticing, actually bothering to make them. He noticed the Colonel. He did not any longer deduce him. The distinction was everything, and it had crept up on him exactly as the fine snow had, a thickening of the air by imperceptible degrees, until one morning the whole thing lay white and changed, and he could not say when it had begun. The peaks he did continue to learn one at a time, because the peaks did not object to being known and asked nothing in return. There was a great table-topped mass to the southwest that took the last of the evening light long after the valley had gone blue, and he learned its name from an attendant and forgot it and learned it again, and the second time it stayed. There was a sharp black horn to the east, the one whose morning shadow he had briefly enslaved himself to timing, and a long white ridge between them like the spine of some sleeping thing, and a lesser peak nearer to hand that caught the sun first of all in the mornings, and that he came to watch for the way a man watches for a familiar face in a crowd. He learned them slowly. He was in no hurry. He kept rediscovering with the same faint astonishment. No hurry about anything, and the mountains would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and every day of a winter that stretched out before him. Now not as a sentence to be served, but as something stranger and less familiar, which he could not at first put a name to, and which turned out, when he finally found the word for it, to be leisure. The word alarmed him. He had known idleness, the black idleness of London between cases, the idleness that drove him to the needle and to firing patriotic initials into the wall in a fury of unspent attention. But that had been idleness under protest, idleness as a caged thing pacing, and it had nothing whatever to do with this. This was idleness that did not pace. This lay still in the sun and let the light move over it and did not reach, even once, for something to do. He distrusted it profoundly. He suspected it in his first fortnight of being a kind of illness in itself, a softening, the beginning of the end of everything that made him what he was. And then a morning came, late in that first month, when the shutters folded back at 7 and the hard flat light came in, and he found that he had slept the whole night through without waking once, and had woken not to the old grey dread but to simple hunger for the milk and the bread, and he lay in his narrow bed and could not for some moments understand what was different, because the thing that was different was the absence of something he had carried so long he had stopped feeling it, the way a man stops feeling the weight of his own coat. He had slept. Not the 2 or 3 hours snatched sideways out of a working night, not the drugged blankness he sometimes bought himself at a cost, but a whole night's sleep, ordinary and deep and given freely, the kind of sleep he vaguely remembered having as a boy and had assumed, without ever quite putting it to himself, that he had simply grown out of, the way one grows out of clothes. He said nothing about it to anyone. There was no one to say it to. Watson was in London believing him dead, and the thought of Watson gave him a small pang there in the bed, quickly set aside. But he lay a while longer than the shutters strictly allowed, in the hard, clean morning light, and considered the fact of his own unremarkable sleep with more attention than he had given to some of his more celebrated cases, and could not, examining it from every angle, find the trick of it. There was no trick. He had come up a mountain and lain in the cold doing nothing for a month, and his body, left finally and utterly without employment, had remembered on its own how to rest, without consulting him at all, without the smallest exercise of his famous will, and had simply gone ahead and done it while he was looking the other way. Frau Brenner passed him on the stairs that morning as he came down late to the milk and the bread, and looked at his face, and stopped. "Ah," she said. It was the whole of her remark, but she said it with the profound and unsurprised satisfaction of a woman who has watched a great many difficult Englishmen arrive at exactly this discovery on exactly this schedule, and who had known from his first night at the window, watching the lamps as though the lamps were doing something, that this one would arrive there too in his own time and against his will, and be quite unable to explain how. She went on up the stairs. Holmes went down to breakfast. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the dining room, the morning was one of the hard blue faceted ones, the far peaks standing close and separate in the clear air, and on the great south balcony the attendants were already carrying out the long chairs, and the wrapped figures were assembling for another day of the cure, another day of lying still in the enormous light and doing, gloriously and curatively, nothing at all. And somewhere along the balcony rail, at an hour Holmes had not yet troubled to fix, an old man he had not yet properly noticed was breaking bread into small pieces for the birds. The Choffs came at 8:30. Holmes fixed the hour eventually, though it cost him something to do it, for fixing hours was one of the habits he had come to the mountain to unlearn, and he was aware, each time he caught himself measuring, of a small private failure. But the Choffs had a punctuality he could not ignore, and the old man who fed them a punctuality more exact still, and between the two of them they laid. Down across the loose fabric of the morning a line so straight that a mind built as Holmes's was built could not help but run along it. They were not, he had established, crows, though at a first careless glance a Londoner might have called them so. They were smaller and neater than any crow, black all over with a wonderful glossy blue-black sheen when the sun caught them, and their beaks were a bright, startling yellow, and their legs a coral red, so that they seemed, against the white snow and the black rock, almost decorated as though someone had taken an ordinary mountain bird and finished it off with a jeweller's care. They came in a loose crying flock down from the crags above the sanatorium, tumbling on the air in a way that had nothing of the crow's heavy purpose in it, and everything of play, sliding and rolling and dropping through the thin, bright air with their yellow beaks open, calling in high, whistling voices that carried enormously in the stillness, and they came every morning to the eastern end of the great south balcony, which happened to be the end where Holmes lay. And every morning, a few moments ahead of them, the old man came out to meet them. He was Austrian. Holmes had this from Frau Brenner, extracted across several days in the small, deniable increments by which one gathers intelligence one has resolved not to gather. His name was Herr Adler, no relation, Holmes reflected with a private and slightly rueful amusement, to the only other bearer of that name who had ever interested him. And he had wintered at Davos for a very long time, longer than the colonel, longer than anyone now resident, so long that his seniority on the balcony was absolute and unquestioned, and he might have had the very centre chair, the warmest and most sheltered spot in the whole establishment, had he wished it. He did not wish it. He kept, by his own choice, to the eastern end, in the morning glare and the corner wind, the least desirable position on the balcony, the same undesirable stretch to which Holmes as a newcomer had been assigned. And it had taken Holmes the better part of a week to understand that the old man kept to it not despite its being poor, but because it was the end the Schofts came to, and that Herr Adler had traded years ago and without a word to anyone the best place on the balcony for the worst, in exchange for the company of the birds. This was the first fact. Holmes noted it and set it down, or tried to. The old man came out each morning at 8:20, 10 minutes ahead of the birds, wrapped not in the sanatorium's blankets but in a long dark coat of his own, very old, very well kept, of a cut that had been fashionable in Vienna perhaps 30 years before, and had been brushed and mended and cared for ever since with a devotion that spoke, to a reader of such things, of a garment that mattered beyond its use. He carried a small cloth bag. He walked the length of the balcony to the eastern rail with the slow, deliberate care of a man whose lungs no longer gave him the breath for haste, pausing twice to rest, nodding gravely to such of the rapt figures as were awake, and he took up his station at the rail and waited, looking out at the peaks, until the first high whistling cry came down from the crags, and then his whole bearing changed. The gravity fell away from him, and he became, for the quarter of an hour that followed, a different and younger man entirely. The bread he brought was not the sanatorium's black bread. This was the second fact, and it was the one that first caught in Holmes's mind like a thread on a nail. The old man crumbled for the birds a pale fine bread, a white roll of the kind the kitchen did not serve, and he brought it in exactly the same quantity each morning. Holmes, watching, put it at a single roll, no more, broken with great care into pieces of a size the birds could take cleanly from his open palm. He did not scatter it upon the rail and step back, as a man merely amusing himself with birds might do. He held it out, in his bare hand, in the cold that made the rest of the balcony keep its hands wrapped and hidden, and he waited patiently until the boldest of the Schofts, there was one bolder than the rest, with a small imperfection in its tail where 2 feathers had grown back crooked after some old mishap, came down onto his wrist and took the bread from his fingers, and only then did the others follow, a dozen of them, crying, and jostling and lifting away and returning until the single white roll was gone. And when it was gone he showed them his empty hands, both of them, turned palm up, the way a man will show his hands to a creature to prove there is no more. And the birds understood this, or seemed to, and lifted away up to the crags in a last loose tumbling crowd. And the old man watched them go, and then the gravity came back down over him like a lowered blind, and he became again an elderly Austrian gentleman in a 30-year-old coat, making his slow, careful way back along the balcony to his chair, pausing twice to rest. The whole thing took a quarter of an hour. It happened every morning without fail, and it was, Holmes thought, the most complete and self-contained human ritual he had ever been privileged to observe, a thing so finished, so exactly itself, that watching it was like watching a clock that had been made by a master and wound once and left to run. And he found, lying wrapped on his chair a few yards off, pretending to watch the peaks, that the quarter of an hour of the troughs had become, without his ever deciding it should, the hour of the day he most looked forward to, and the one around which, secretly, all the rest of his motionless morning arranged itself. He resisted the old man for a long time. That was how he put it to himself later. Telling me by our own fire, I resisted him. As though Herr Adler had been not a mild elderly convalescent feeding birds, but a case, a client, a problem laid deliberately in Holmes's path to tempt him from his cure. And in a sense that was exactly what the old man was, or what Holmes's own machinery insisted on making of him. For here, laid out each morning with the regularity of an experiment, was precisely the kind of small human puzzle that Holmes's whole life had trained him to solve. A man of evident former means, reduced now to a long residence at a sanatorium, a coat kept far past its natural life, a self-imposed exile to the worst corner of the balcony, a private and elaborate daily ceremony performed for a flock of mountain birds with a bread the man must be procuring at some trouble, and probably some cost, since the kitchen did not bake it. There was a story there. There was, more than a story, a system, a set of facts that hung together and pointed, as facts always pointed for Holmes, toward a single explanation that would account for all of them at once. And the machine that had slept for a month came awake in the cold, without fuss, at the eastern end of the balcony, and set itself to the work it had been built for, and began to close upon Herr Adler the way it had closed upon 10,000 men before him. He caught it doing so. That was the discipline he had come to the mountain to learn, and it was the only thing that saved the old man from being solved inside a week. Each morning the machine gathered its facts, the coat, the corner, the white bread, the shown empty hands, and each morning, lying wrapped in the glare with the choughs crying and the old man's face gone young at the rail, Holmes felt the moment approach when the explanation would arrive, complete and final and correct, and he would know the whole of Herr Adler's history and heart at a glance, as he had known the sledge drivers, uninvited, like a mouse on the counterpane. And each morning, with an effort that did not grow easier, but grew, if anything, harder, as the facts accumulated and the solution ripened, he set the machine down before it could close. He looked away from the old man. He looked at the peaks, which asked nothing. He made himself unknow deliberately what he had half known, and it was the strangest labour of his life, this refusing to understand, this holding of a door shut against his own nature, and he was not at all certain, some mornings, why he did it, only that it seemed suddenly and enormously to matter that he should. For there was a third fact, and it was the third fact that made the difference, the one that turned the whole matter from a puzzle he was declining to solve into something he found he did not wish to solve at all. The third fact was the old man's face, in the moment the boldest chough came down onto his wrist. Holmes had seen a great many faces in a great many extreme conditions. He had seen faces at the moment of confession, and faces at the moment of ruin, faces of men learning they were saved, and faces of men learning they were not. And he had read them all with the same cool attention, and filed what he read and used it. He had never, he thought, until that eastern balcony and that cold, clear morning air, seen a face do quite what the old Austrian's face did, when the crooked-tailed chough settled on his wrist and took the bread from his fingers. It was not happiness exactly, though there was happiness in it. It was something more particular and more piercing than that. It was the face of a man being for 1/4 of an hour out of the 24 expected, awaited, needed even in the small and total way that a creature needs the hand that feeds it. And Holmes, watching it, understood without any exercise of his machinery at all, understood in the plain human way that requires no deduction and admits of no cleverness, that whatever else was true of Herr Adler and his coat and his corner and his careful white bread, the centre of it was this, that the birds were the one thing left in the world that came to him and knew him and would be sorry, or would at least be hungry, which for a creature is nearly the same thing, if one morning he did not appear. And having understood that, Holmes found he could not bear to understand the rest. The machine offered it to him daily, the full solution, the whole sad, tidy history that would account for every fact, and daily he refused delivery and turned it away at the door, and looked instead at the great table-topped peak taking the morning sun, because to solve Herr Adler, he had begun to feel, would be to do the man a violence of a kind Holmes had never before considered a violence at all. It would be to take the one finished, private, self-contained thing the old man had made of his diminished life and pull it open and see the works. It would be to reduce the shown empty hands and the crooked-tailed bird and the 30-year-old coat to a case, with a solution that Holmes could have set down in a paragraph and been done with. And there rose in him, for the first time in his life, against the whole grain and habit of his nature, a fierce and protective wish that the old man should never, as long as he lived, be solved by anyone, least of all by him. He was aware of the strangeness of this. He turned it over, lying wrapped in the glare, and could not make it fit anything he knew about himself. All his life the not knowing had been the intolerable thing, the itch, the ache, the state from which he fled by any means to his hand. And here he was labouring, sweating almost, to preserve a not knowing, to keep a door shut that his whole being strained to open, and finding in the keeping of it not frustration, but something he could only call peace. It made no sense. He decided after some days to stop requiring it to make sense, which was itself a decision of a kind he had never before been capable of, and which he suspected the mountain, or the milk, or the long white idle hours had somehow made possible in him without his consent. The weather turned on the morning he came nearest to failing. It had been a stretch of hard blue days, faceted and brilliant, the peak standing close and the light coming off the snow in its enormous flood. And on such mornings the choughs came sharp and clear against the sky, and the whole ritual played out in a merciless brightness in which every detail stood separate and legible. And on one such morning, the 9th or 10th of his watching, the machine very nearly won. The facts had ripened past bearing. The solution hung so close and so complete that Holmes could feel the shape of it pressing against the inside of his held-shut discipline, and he lay rigid on his chair with his eyes on the old man's shown empty hands and knew that in another moment he would have it whole, would know the wife or the son or the fortune or the disgrace that lay behind the coat and the corner and the bread, would have solved Herr Adler as surely and as finally as he had ever solved anything. And he was on the very edge of it. The door giving, the works about to show, when the weather turned. It turned as the mountain weather did, all at once and without apology. A wind came round the eastern corner of the balcony, the corner wind that was the price of the chough's company, and it came laden, and behind it, faster than seemed possible, the hard blue sky filled from the west with a grey that was almost brown at its heart, and the light that had been a flood became in the space. Of 2 minutes a thin and failing thing, and the first snow came stinging horizontally along the balcony rail. The wrapped figures stirred, attendants appeared. There was a general slow migration indoors, blankets gathered, chairs abandoned, the melancholy Russian helped weeping to his feet, the colonel loudly and wrongly declaring it a mere squall that would pass in 10 minutes. And in the sudden grey confusion of it, the birds crying and scattering up to the crags, the snow thickening, the old man's careful ritual broken off half-finished with a good third of the white roll still in his hand. In all that, the machine lost its grip. The facts that had lain so still and legible in the blue glare blew apart in the grey wind, and the solution that had hung a hair's breadth from Holmes's grasp dissolved, and the door he had strained so long to keep shut was slammed shut for him from outside by the weather. He lay a moment longer than he should have, as the snow came down on him, watching the old man. For Herr Adler had not gone in with the others. He stood at the rail in the thickening storm, in his 30-year-old coat, with the wind taking the snow past him almost level, and he looked up at the crags where the birds had gone, and there was distress on his face. Not for himself, not for the cold or the storm, but for the third of a roll still in his hand, the bread the birds had not stayed to take. He stood there with his uneaten offering held out into the wind toward the empty air where the choughs had been, an old man in a storm holding bread out to birds that had already fled, and his face was the face of someone who has failed at the one small task the day had given him, who will lie awake, perhaps, on the knowledge that the crooked-tailed bird went hungry this morning and did not understand why the hand had nothing more to give. And Holmes, wrapped and snow-dusted on his abandoned chair, the last patient left on the balcony, felt the whole of it go through him, not as a deduction, not as a solution, but as a plain and simple ache, the kind of ache that requires no cleverness whatever, and that his cleverness had, if anything, always rather protected him from. He did not solve the old man. He saw him. And there is all the difference in the world, he told me by our fire years later, between the two, a difference he had spent his whole life failing to notice, and had come to a mountain in Switzerland and lain in the cold doing nothing for a season before he finally and almost too late began to learn. An attendant came for him then, exclaiming, and got him up and wrapped and moving indoors, scolding him gently for a fool of an Englishman who would lie in a snowstorm sooner than admit the cure was over for the day. Holmes let himself be scolded. At the balcony door he looked back once. The old man had turned at last from the rail and was making his slow way in through the driving snow. Pausing, resting, the uneaten bread returned to its cloth bag, his face composed again into its usual gravity. An elderly Austrian gentleman, of former means, in a well-kept coat, walking in out of the weather, with nothing about him now to tell the world that 15 minutes before he had been, for a quarter of an hour, the most necessary man on the mountain. Tomorrow, if the weather held, the birds would come again at 8:30, and he would be there at 20 past to meet them, 10 minutes early, with a fresh white roll. Holmes knew this the way he knew the peaks now, by having watched it turn and turn again until it became simply part of the shape of the world. And he knew too, lying that night in his narrow bed, listening to the snow slide off the roof in soft collapsing rushes, warm and unaccountably moved, and further than ever from sleep and yet nearer than ever to rest, that he had come within a hair, that clear bright morning, of solving something he would have given a great deal, afterward, never to have solved at all. The weather had saved him from it. He was grateful to the weather. It was, he reflected, drifting at last toward the deep and ordinary sleep the mountain had taught him. The first time in his life he had ever been grateful for being prevented from knowing something, and he suspected, rightly, that it would not be the last. The dinner hour at the sanatorium was in its own small way the great social theatre of the day, and Holmes came to study it, though study is the wrong word now, and finding the right one was itself part of what the season did to him, with an attention he had once reserved for far graver rooms, for the balcony, being governed by its rule of silence, gave a man very little to work with beyond posture and the set of a mouth. The dining room gave him everything. Here, released from the discipline of the cure, the patients talked, and the talking laid bare in an hour what the balcony would not have surrendered in a month. Here the whole delicate order of the place, invisible on the balcony except in the matter of chairs, came out into the open and disported itself over the milk and the soup, and the plain, wholesome food the doctor permitted, and a man with eyes could sit at his own small table near the door, for seating in the dining room too went by tenure, and Holmes as a newcomer was near the door where the draught came in each time it opened, and watched the entire human comedy of the mountain arrange and rearrange itself twice a day with the reliability of a mechanism and the unpredictability of a family. Colonel Harrowbone presided. There was no other word for what the colonel did at dinner. He presided from the best table, the one nearest the stove, which his 6 winters' tenure had earned him, and which he occupied with the settled proprietary calm of a man who has confused a seat by a stove with a throne. He was a large, red, kindly, monumentally certain man, and he held opinions on every subject in the known world, and he was wrong about most of them with a consistency that Holmes came to find almost restful, the way one finds a bad clock restful once one has learned exactly how much it loses. The colonel's great subject, as has been said, was the weather, and his forecasts were delivered each evening to the assembled room as bulletins from a personal understanding with the sky, and they were wrong so reliably that Holmes privately began to use them as an instrument, for whatever the colonel confidently predicted at dinner, the opposite might be depended upon by morning, and Holmes found he could plan his cure with more confidence by inverting the colonel than the establishment's own barometer afforded. "Clear and cold tomorrow," the colonel would announce, buttering his bread with the air of a man conferring a favour upon the day. "Mark me, high pressure coming down from the north. I have a feeling in the old wound." He had been shot, it was understood, at some point in some campaign, though the location of both the wound and the campaign varied with the telling, and the old wound has never once been wrong. And in the morning the cloud would be down upon the valley like a wet grey wool, the peaks gone, the balcony a raft afloat in nothing, and the colonel would appear at breakfast entirely undismayed, remarking that the high pressure had been deflected, a thing that happened, that any real student of mountain weather would tell you happened, and that in no way reflected upon the soundness of the original forecast or the reliability of the old wound. Holmes came to look forward to these deflections as a connoisseur looks forward to a favourite passage. There was something magnificent in a wrongness so complete and so serenely maintained. It was, he thought, a kind of achievement, and he would not have corrected the Colonel for the world, even had correction been possible, which it manifestly was not. The two Miss Fanshaws sat at a table of middling rank, better than Holmes's, worse than the Colonel's, exactly appropriate to a residence of some 3 winters, and prospects of a certain modest brightness, and conducted from it a campaign of the most gentle and relentless kind. The elder, Miss Augusta, was the one with the chest, or the one to whom the chest was officially attributed. The younger, Miss Cecily, had come, the whole room understood without a word ever being spoken on the matter, chiefly to be near her sister, and to be, incidentally and not at all by design, in a place where a young woman of good sense and small fortune might be seen to advantage by gentlemen with time on their hands and lungs in need of care. Davos, Holmes had grasped early, ran a permanent quiet surplus of exactly such gentlemen. Men sent up for the air with private incomes and empty afternoons and a natural inclination, in all that idleness and altitude, toward the companionship of anyone who would talk to them, and the Miss Fanshaws worked. This surplus, with the skill that Holmes, who had watched professionals of many kinds at their trades, could only admire. It was done entirely through the medium of concern. Miss Cecily was concerned about the young German philosopher's colour. She was concerned that Herr, she never could manage the melancholy Russian's name, was not eating. She was, above all and most productively, concerned about whichever solvent bachelor had most recently arrived, in a manner so warm and so sisterly and so entirely without visible design that the bachelor in question was generally halfway to being managed before he understood that any management was afoot. Holmes watched the elder Miss Fanshawe watch her sister work and read in the set of Miss Augusta's mouth the whole weary history of it, the years of it, the near misses, the gentleman 2 winters back who had seemed so promising, and had gone home to Surrey and married a curate's daughter instead. The thinning of hope stretched over too many seasons, and underneath it all the fierce and unshowy love of an elder sister, determined that Cecily at least, Cecily who was younger and prettier, and had wasted her best years nursing a sister's cough at the top of a mountain, should not go home unspoken for. He read all this in an evening complete, the way he read everything. And then, this was the change, this was the whole strange education of the season. He found that having read it he did nothing with it, and wished in fact that he had not read it at all, because Miss Augusta's weary love for her sister was not his to know, and knowing it made him, absurdly, feel that he had opened a letter addressed to someone else. This was new. In London he had opened 1,000 such letters, and felt nothing but the small clean satisfaction of the seal giving way. The whole apparatus of his life had rested on the untroubled assumption that a man's history, written plainly enough on his boots and his cuffs and the corner of his mouth, for anyone with the wit to read it, was thereby public property, available to be read, and that the reading of it was a neutral act like observing the weather. He had never once questioned this. It had never occurred to him that there might be an ethics to it, that the sister's love and the old man's grief and the Colonel's tender, absurd vanity might be theirs, private, not laid out for his consumption, merely because his eye happened to be sharp enough to take them. And it was occurring to him now in the sanatorium dining room over the milk and the plain food, and he did not entirely welcome it, for it complicated a great many things he had thought settled, and it made the exercise of his greatest faculty feel, for the first time, faintly like a trespass. He said as much to no one. There was no one to say it to. The thought of Watson came again, and again the small pang, and again he set it aside. But he noticed that he was setting it aside more often now, that Watson had begun to appear in his mind at exactly these moments. The moments of noticing something he could not have noticed in London, as though some part of Holmes was saving these discoveries up, involuntarily, to be told one day to the one man who might understand what they cost. The young German philosopher, whose name was Herr Vogt, took his meals as he took the cure, with a ferocious and joyless seriousness, and the whole room had come to regard his progress toward health as a kind of grim public spectacle, like the ascent of a difficult peak. He had come out, it was understood, with a genuine weakness of the chest and a conviction, forged in some university where such convictions were forged, that the weakness could be conquered as a philosophical problem might be conquered by sufficient application of the will. He rested harder than anyone. He breathed the mountain air in great deliberate draughts as though drinking it. He ate exactly what the doctor prescribed and not one mouthful more, and he watched the colonel eat his bread with a butter the doctor tolerated but did not encourage, and one could see him composing behind his young, severe brow a treatise upon the moral degradation of the English convalescent. He was insufferable, and Holmes was rather fond of him, in the way one is fond of the very young when they are certain of things, and he watched Herr Vogt's slow, reluctant discovery, for it was coming, the mountain would see to it, that health was not a peak to be stormed, but a thing that arrived, if it arrived at all, exactly as sleep had arrived to Holmes of its own accord, while one was looking the other way and had stopped trying to command it. And there was the melancholy Russian, who came late to dinner and left early and spoke to no one and wept sometimes into his soup, silently, without disturbance, and whom the entire room, from the colonel down, protected with a delicacy that Holmes found more moving than any amount of open kindness would have been. No one spoke to the Russian of his sorrow, no one asked. The Miss Fanshaws did not manage him. The colonel did not forecast at him. Even Herr Vogt suspended his philosophy in the Russian's vicinity. The whole small society of the mountain had arrived, without conference, at the same silent agreement, that here was a grief too large to be touched, and that the only kindness left was to let it alone, to make a space around it, to pass the bread and pour the milk and behave, gently and unceasingly, as though nothing were wrong, so that the man might weep in company and be, in his weeping, not observed. Holmes watched this happen, night after night, and thought that he had seen a great deal of what human beings did to one another in extremity, most of it in the way of harm, and that he had not often seen anything finer than the way a dozen invalids on a mountain contrived to leave one weeping stranger his dignity. And presiding over all of it, invisibly, was Herr Adler. For the old Austrian dined too, of course, at the very best table of all, better even than the colonel's, the table nearest the stove and furthest from the door, which his enormous seniority had earned him, and which he occupied without the smallest air of occupying anything. He was the senior man on the mountain. Everyone knew it. The colonel deferred to it, in the ungracious manner of a man deferring to a rank he privately feels should have been his. The seating acknowledged it, and yet Herr Adler carried his seniority so lightly, spent so little of the capital of it, that a newcomer might have dined in the room a week before understanding that the courteous, silent old gentleman by the stove outranked them all. He spoke little at dinner. He was unfailingly, gravely courteous to those near him. He asked the melancholy Russian, once in Holmes's hearing, whether the soup was to his liking in a French that both men could manage, and he asked it in a way that carried no other question inside it. No probe, no concern on display, merely the plain small courtesy of one exile to another, and the Russian had answered, and something had passed between the two of them, some brief acknowledgement across whatever each was carrying, and then it was over, and the old man had returned to his soup, and Holmes had understood that Herr Adler, alone in the room, had earned the right to speak to the Russian's grief, and had used it exactly once, and gently, and would not use it again. It was at dinner that the last of it resolved. Holmes had held the door shut against the old man's solution for weeks now, on the balcony, in the mornings, with the choffs. He had refused delivery of the whole sad, tidy history his machinery kept offering, and he had believed, in so far as he examined the matter at all, that the refusing was working, that by declining to solve Herr Adler, he had kept the man unsolved, whole, private, his own. But the mind that had been built as Holmes's mind was built did not, it turned out, require his permission to work, any more than his body had required his permission to sleep. It worked in the dark, below the level where he could stop it, gathering and fitting and turning, and one evening at dinner, watching the old man ask the Russian about the soup and then withdraw again into his courteous solitude, Holmes felt the whole thing arrive, complete, unbidden, exactly as he had sworn it should not as a deduction he had made, but as a knowledge he simply, suddenly, had. The way one turns a corner and there is the sea. He knew why the old man came. He did not want to know. He had laboured for weeks not to know. But he knew now, sitting near the draughty door with the milk going cold in front of him, and the knowing was not the clean triumphant click of a case resolved, but something slower and heavier that settled into him and would not lift. He knew that Herr Adler was not, and had perhaps never truly been, ill, that the chest which had first brought him to the mountain, if it had ever been more than a pretext, had long since healed or long since ceased to matter, and that the old man came back to Davos each winter now, and had come back for more winters than anyone could count, not for the cure but for the mountain itself, and the balcony, and the ordered unvarying days, and above all for the birds. He came because at home, wherever home had been, Vienna, some tall shuttered apartment with too many rooms, there was no one. He came because he was a widower, the coat 30 years old because it was the coat of a marriage 30 years old and more, kept and brushed and mended not out of poverty, but out of a fidelity that had outlived its object and attached itself, having nowhere else to go, to a garment. He came because a man who has outlived his wife, and Holmes somehow knew this too, without being able to say how, his children, or his one child, a man who has outlived the people who once expected him at a table, who once needed him to come home, will find, if he is lucky, and if he is wise, and if he has the means, some small daily thing in the world that still expects him, that still turns its face to him, and is glad, or at least is hungry, which for the bereaved is nearly as good, and that Herr Adler had found his, high on a mountain, in a flock of red-legged birds, and had traded the best chair on the balcony for the worst in order to be near them, and rose each morning at an hour no cure required to be at the rail 10 minutes early, with a white roll the kitchen did not bake, so that the one small task the day still gave him should be done, and done well, and never once failed. That was the whole of it. There was no crime in it, no shame, no secret that would have interested a soul at Scotland Yard, or sold a single copy of the Strand. There was only an old man and his grief, and the shape he had made of it, a shape so private and so carefully kept that to speak it aloud, even to speak it in the silence of one's own head, felt like an intrusion of the gravest kind. And Holmes, having at last against all his effort come to know it, sat very still at his small table by the door, and did not finish his milk, and understood that the not knowing he had fought to preserve was gone now, spent, and that all that remained to him was the far harder discipline of knowing and saying nothing, of holding a truth he had never wanted and could never now be rid of, and of protecting the old man's privacy not by refusing to see it, that was past, but by the sterner course of seeing it entire, and letting no glance, no word, no smallest change in his own courteous distance ever betray that he had seen. He was, he realized, better placed than any man on the mountain to do this. He had spent his whole life learning to conceal what he knew until the moment of revelation. He had only now to conceal it forever and reveal it never. It was the same skill turned to a wholly new purpose, and he found, examining the prospect, that the new purpose suited him, that there was a satisfaction in it deeper and more unfamiliar than any he had known in the old work. The satisfaction not of the reveal but of the withholding, not of solving a man but of having solved him, setting the solution down forever and walking away and leaving the man exactly as whole as one had found him. The weather that evening was the wet, heavy kind that comes before a thaw, unseasonable. The snow on the sills gone sodden and grey, water finding its way along the gutters with a sound the whole dining room could hear beneath the talk, and the Colonel forecast a hard freeze to follow, which meant by Holmes's reliable inversion that the thaw would hold, and it did. In the afternoons there was the walk. This was the one exertion the cure permitted, and it was hedged about with rules, a set distance, a set pace, no straining, back before the light went and the cold came down. But within those rules it was a freedom, and Holmes came to love the afternoon walk with an intensity that would have astonished the man he had been in London, who had walked the whole endless city by night in pursuit of things, and had never once walked anywhere merely to walk. The path went down from the sanatorium through a stand of pines to a place where the trees opened on a view of the lower valley, and then turned and came back, and it was perhaps a mile in all, and Holmes walked it every afternoon that the weather allowed, and some that it did not, and he came to know the pine wood the way he'd come to know the peaks, slowly and by heart, and without ever setting himself to learn it. The pines were very old and very tall, and they held the snow in their upper branches in great soft loads that came down now and then, in the thaw, in sudden white collapses that Holmes learned to listen for. A creak, a hush, and then the soft heavy fall of it through the lower branches to the ground, and then the branch swinging up relieved of its burden, releasing a fine glittering dust of snow that hung in the low afternoon light. The wood smelt of resin and cold, and faintly of the earth beneath the snow where the thaw had begun to reach it. A green, wet mineral smell that was the first Holmes had caught all winter of the spring that was still months off, and he stood in the wood in the failing light breathing it, and thought about very little, which was the whole art the mountain had taught him, and was better at it now than he had been. He met the others sometimes on the walk. He met the Miss Fanshaws, taking their own permitted mile, Miss Cecily bright and busy with concern for the health of some absent bachelor, Miss Augusta watchful beside her, and he raised his hat and passed a courteous word and read, unwillingly and completely, the whole state of their campaign off the animation of the one and the fatigue of the other, and did nothing with it, and walked on. He met Herr Vogt striding the path at a philosopher's furious pace, conquering the prescribed mile as a moral exercise, and inclined his head, and was gravely inclined to in return. Once, near the turning of the path where the trees opened, he came upon the melancholy Russian standing alone at the edge of the view, looking down at the lower valley where the thaw had bared patches of dark ground among the snow, and Holmes had checked and not approached and turned back the way he had come, leaving the man his grief and his view, and had understood as he walked away that he had done, without thinking, exactly what Herr Adler would have done and the whole silent society of the mountain, that he had learned the mountain's one great manner, which was to leave a suffering man alone, and that he had learned it here, on this path, in this thaw, from people he had at first taken for a collection of invalids and a comedy, and had come to regard, without ever deciding to, as something nearer to a company he was glad to belong to. He had not met Herr Adler on the walk. The old man did not walk, his lungs would not carry him down through the pines and back, and his one daily exertion was the length of the balcony, morning and evening, to the rail and the birds and back to his chair. So the wood was free of him, and Holmes found the wood a good place to carry the new knowledge he could not put down, the knowledge of why the old man came, turning it over among the pines in the resinous cold, growing used to the weight of it, learning to hold it in a way that did not press, so that he could carry it back up to the sanatorium and into the dining room and out onto the balcony each morning and never once by any sign let it show. And it was on the walk, on one of these thawing afternoons, with the snow coming down out of the pines in its soft collapses and the green smell of the waking earth rising faintly through the cold, that Holmes thought again of the letter to Mycroft. He owed his brother a letter. He had owed it now for something over 2 weeks, for he had written on his arrival a brief coded thing establishing that he lived and was safe, and where, the barest signal, and Mycroft had answered with the barest acknowledgment, and there the correspondence had lapsed on Holmes's side, out of a negligence he could not at first account for and had lately begun to understand. He had meant to write. He had sat down to it twice in the evenings by the stove in his room, with paper and the sanatorium's poor ink, and had found that he had nothing to say. This was the extraordinary thing, the thing he turned over among the pines, that he, who had never in his life lacked for something to communicate, who had filled telegram after telegram with dense instruction and monograph after monograph with dense observation, sat down to write to the one man in England who knew he lived and found the page entirely empty. Because what was there? There was no case. There was no progress to report, no problem being worked, no development his brother's mind would recognise as information. There was milk and black bread, and the shutters at 7, and the light on the snow, and an old man who fed the birds. There was a man learning to sleep. There was nothing that Mycroft, sitting vast and immovable in the Diogenes Club with the affairs of a nation folded in his head, would know how to read. And Holmes discovered, among the thawing pines, that he did not want to write it down, did not want to render the mountain and the milk and the old man and the slow unclenching of his own long cramped mind into the clipped code of a brother's correspondence, did not want to make it into information at all, because the moment he made it into information, it would become a thing that could be assessed and reported and acted upon, and it was none of those things. It was only and precisely and preciously his own. So the letter went unwritten. 2 weeks, and now nearer 3, and Holmes stood in the pine wood in the failing light of a thawing afternoon, and made deliberately the decision to let it go on being unwritten a while longer, to let Mycroft wonder, mildly, as Mycroft would, without alarm, since the signal of his living had been sent and received, to keep the mountain, for now, to himself. It was the first time in his life he had ever chosen not to communicate something. He could have communicated, not from strategy, not to conceal, but simply because the thing was too much his own to give away, and he recognised in the choice the same movement of the spirit that had made him refuse for weeks to solve the old man, the discovery late and strange and entirely against his nature, that there were things in the world better kept whole than known, better held in silence than set down in words, better left in the end, beautifully and forever alone. The light was going. He turned back up the path, the snow whispering down out of the pines behind him, and climbed slowly toward the lights of the sanatorium, which were coming on now one by one in the blue dusk exactly as the lamps of the town came on far below. And he was in no hurry, and there was no reason to be, and at the top there would be milk and bread and the low warm room and the melancholy Russian at his soup, and the Colonel forecasting weather that would not come, and the Miss Fanshaws at their gentle work, and Herr Vogt conquering his convalescence, and the old Austrian by the stove, courteous and solitary and carrying, all unknowing, a grief that one man in the room now shared and would never speak of. And in the morning the birds would come. The thaw did not hold after all. The Colonel had forecast a hard freeze, and Holmes, trusting as ever in the perfect inversion of the Colonel, had expected the mild wet weather to continue, and for once the mountain confounded them both, which was, Holmes reflected, the mountain's privilege and perhaps its final lesson, that it answered to no man's system, not the Colonel's feeling in the old wound, nor Holmes's ironic faith in the Colonel being wrong. What came instead of either freeze or thaw was a great stillness. It settled over the valley in the last week of that first month like a held note. The wet grey weather that had loosened the snow simply stopped, one evening, and cleared away northward in the night, and Holmes woke to shutters folding back at 7 upon a morning so entirely without motion that he lay a moment doubting his own senses. There was no wind. There had nearly always been some wind, some small movement in the pines or along the balcony rail, some faint stir of the enormous air, and now there was none at all, and the absence of it was so complete that it had a quality of sound, the way a stopped clock in a familiar room announces itself by the silence where its ticking used to be. The valley lay under a sky of the palest, clearest, most depthless blue, without a single cloud from rim to rim, and the snow on the peaks and the snow on the slopes, and the snow along the balcony rail all lay exactly as the last fall had left it, unmoved, unmarked, perfect, and the cold that came in at 7 o'clock through the cracked window was the purest cold Holmes had breathed all winter, so clean it seemed almost to have a taste of stone and distance and nothing else. He went out to the cure that morning into a world holding utterly still, the rapt figures assembled along the balcony as they did every morning, but the stillness of the day had got into them too, and there was less shifting, less of the small settling and resettling by which a row of bored invalids ordinarily passed the hours. Even the Colonel's carrying whisper was subdued, as though the great windless clarity had rebuked it. The light came up the valley slowly, sliding across the snowfields opposite in a broad advancing edge, and Holmes lay and watched it come, and for once did not time it, did not measure it, did not do anything at all with it but let it arrive, and he understood, lying there in the perfect stillness, that this was the day. He could not have said how he knew, but the season had been building toward something, some completion, and the great still morning had the quality of an arrival, and he waited for it wrapped in his blankets in the eastern glare without impatience, in a state he had no name for and would later understand had been a kind of readiness. At 8:20 the old man came out. He came as he always came, in the 30-year-old coat, with the small cloth bag, walking the length of the balcony with his slow, deliberate care, pausing twice to rest, but the stillness of the day lay on him too, and there was in his progress that morning a kind of ceremony, or Holmes imagined there was, the sense of a thing being done for perhaps the 1000th time and being done, that 1000th time with all the care of the first. He reached the eastern rail. He set down the bag. He took out the white roll and began to break it, and his breath stood about his head in the windless cold in a small unmoving cloud, and he looked up at the crags where the birds would come from, and waited. And Holmes, watching, felt the danger of the morning declare itself. And it was not the danger he had guarded against all these weeks. He had known the truth of the old man since the evening at dinner, when it had arrived unbidden and settled in him and would not lift. There was no more not knowing to protect. What woke in him now, in the great clarity of that still morning, was something he had not reckoned on at all. The second reflex, the deeper one, the one that lay below even the compulsion to solve, the compulsion, having solved, to prove, to speak, to complete the thing by confirming it, to see the truth reflected back off the old man's own face and hear the click of it settle into certainty. For the whole architecture of Holmes's life had never ended at the solution. The solution was only the halfway point. It demanded its completion, and the completion had always, all his life, been the reveal. The assembled listeners, the chain of reasoning laid out link by shining link, the astonished faces, the deep craftsman's pleasure of showing the work, of making the hidden thing visible, of saying here is what was true all along, and here is how I knew. That was the shape of his whole life. That was what he was for, and it woke now, in the still bright morning, at the eastern end of the balcony, and it wanted the old man. It wanted, Holmes realized with a kind of horror, to be confirmed. He could feel the exact shape of how it would go. He would need only to approach the rail some morning and remark, courteously, gently, in the French they both had, some small true thing. The birds know you, monsieur. They come to you and to no one else. And he would watch the old man's face as he said it, and the face would tell him everything, would confirm in an instant the whole reconstruction, the wife, the emptied house, the found necessity. And there would be, in that confirmation, the old clean click of a thing proved, the pleasure that had been the pleasure of his whole life. It would cost the old man nothing, some part of Holmes argued, a single remark. A moment's understanding between two men. Where was the harm? The old man need never know how much had been seen, only that he had been, for a moment, gently, kindly, understood. And Holmes lay very still in his blankets and recognized the argument for exactly what it was, which was the oldest and most seductive argument his own nature had ever made to him, dressed now, for the first time, in the borrowed clothes of kindness. Where is the harm? He had said it, or thought it, at the door of 100 private rooms. It was the skeleton key of his whole profession, the reason that let him open anything, and he saw now, in the still cold morning with the choughs crying and the old man's face gone young at the rail, that it had always been a lie, or if not a lie, then a truth so partial as to serve as one, that there was harm, that there had always been harm, in the opening of what another had chosen to keep shut, and that the harm was not in what the opening did to the thing revealed, but in what it did to the person from whom it was taken. To be understood, Holmes saw, truly understood, seen to the centre by a stranger's eye, is not always a gift. It can be a kind of exposure that no kindness in the delivery can soften. The old man had made his private thing and kept it private. He had told no one, dressed it, defended it. And the privacy of it was not incidental to it, but the whole of its dignity. For a grief that has found its own quiet shape, and asks nothing of anyone, is a grief a man may carry with his head up, and a grief that has been seen, and named, and gently remarked upon by a clever stranger, even in the softest possible words, is a grief that has been made, however tenderly, into a spectacle, and the man who carries it can never again be quite sure it is not being watched. Holmes understood this all at once, wholly, in the still morning, and understood with it the true size of what his own nature was asking of him, and how nearly he had granted it under the cover of a kindness that was no kindness at all, but only the old hunger to prove, to complete, to reveal, wearing a gentler face. He had come within a remark of it. He could feel the remark still, formed and ready, needing only to be carried down the balcony to the rail and spoken. And he lay in his blankets and did not carry it, and the not carrying of it was the hardest single thing he had done in the whole hard season of doing nothing, harder than the refusing to solve, far harder, because the refusing to solve had been a labour against a habit, and this was a labour against the very core of him, against the thing he had built his life to be, against the deep and ancient pleasure of the shown work and the proved case and the astonished face. The birds finished the bread. The old man showed them his empty hands, both of them, palm up in the still air, and the flock understood, and lifted away, crying, up into the depthless blue toward the crags, and the quarter of an hour was over. Herr Adler watched them go. The gravity came back down over him, the years came back, and he stooped a little to gather his cloth bag, an elderly gentleman in an old good coat, and began his slow return along the balcony, pausing to rest, nodding gravely to the rapt figures as he passed. And he passed, in time, the chair where Holmes lay, and inclined his head to Holmes as he inclined it to all of them, courteously, distantly, with no idea in the world that the tall, thin Englishman wrapped in his blankets had, that morning, in the great stillness, come within a single sentence of laying the whole of the old man's heart bare between them, and had was choosing in that very moment, as the old man's grave, courteous eyes met his and passed on, not to let a single flicker of it show. Holmes returned the nod. That was all. A slight inclination of the head, one convalescent to another, in the windless morning, and behind it, invisible, held with a control he had spent 30 years perfecting for wholly other purposes, the entire withheld truth of the old man's life, seen and kept, and never by any sign betrayed. The old man passed on down the balcony to his chair, and Holmes lay back in the still bright cold, and let out a breath that stood unmoving in the air above him, and felt, where he had expected to feel the frustration of an unproved case, something else entirely, something he had never felt at the close of any investigation in his life, because no investigation in his life had ever closed this way, with the truth found and held and deliberately, finally, given back unspoken to the man it belonged to. He felt, of all things, relief, and beneath the relief, spreading slowly through him in the windless morning like the light spreading across the snowfields opposite, something he was almost afraid to name, because he had wanted it so long without knowing he wanted it, and had come so far to find it, and had not until this exact moment understood that it had arrived. He felt at peace. Not the peace of a problem solved. He knew that peace well, and it was a sharp, bright thing that faded within the hour and left him hungry for the next. This was a different peace, broad and slow and without any hunger in it at all, the peace of a man who has been offered the thing he most wants and has, for once, for the first time, wanted something else more and chosen it, and found in the choosing not loss but a strange sufficiency, as though the withholding had given him something the revealing never could, some still standing room inside himself he had not known was there. He lay in it a long time. The light finished its slow advance across the valley. The morning wore on, still and clear and perfect, the peak standing close in the depthless blue, the snow unmarked, the great windless silence holding the whole valley in its held note. And Holmes, who had come to a mountain to learn to rest and had spent a month learning instead to notice the engine and set it down, understood at last, in the stillness, that this was the final lesson, and had always been the final lesson toward which all the others had been building, that the setting down was not a defeat of his nature but a completion of it, that a man may have the sharpest eye in England and choose, out of something better than cleverness, not to use it, that the greatest deductions are sometimes the ones a man makes in perfect silence and carries to his grave, and that there is a mastery higher than the mastery of the reveal, in the seeing of a truth entire and the giving of it back, unspoken, whole, to the one it belongs to, a mastery he had never known he lacked, and had come all this way, and lain a month in the cold doing nothing at last to learn. The colonel along the balcony forecast in a carrying whisper that the fine weather could not possibly last, that a change was coming, that he felt it in the old wound. Holmes, without turning his head, and with a small private smile that no one saw, understood that the fine weather would therefore hold for days. It held for days. And in the low, warm dining room that evening, over the milk and the black bread, with the melancholy Russian at his soup, and the Miss Fanshaws at their gentle work, and Herr Vogt breathing his philosophical breaths, and the colonel presiding wrongly over the weather from his seat by the stove, the old Austrian sat at the best table, courteous and solitary, and asked no one about the soup, and was asked nothing in return, and finished his meal in his usual grave silence, and went up to his room to rest so that he might rise in the morning at 8:20, 10 minutes early, with a fresh white roll, and be at the rail when the birds came down out of the still cold air, and be, for his quarter of an hour, in the one way that was left to him, and the only way he needed, expected. Holmes watched him go and said nothing, and finished his own milk and was content. There remained, he knew, only the question of what he would do with the rest of the winter, for the season was not over, and the mornings would go on, the birds would go on coming, the old man would go on being at the rail to meet them, and Holmes would go on lying a few chairs off, holding his silence, being every morning newly not tempted and newly choosing not to be. He thought he could do that. He thought indeed that he might do it for the whole of the rest of the winter, and be the better for the doing, that the daily small discipline of the withheld remark might be exactly the cure the doctor had never quite been able to name, the thing that would finish in him the work the milk and the balcony and the mountain air had begun. He would lie in the cold each morning and watch the old man be needed, and want to say so, and not say so, and in the not saying find over and over the strange broad peace he had found that still bright morning, until the wanting grew faint perhaps, and then fainter, and one morning was simply not there at all, and he would watch the birds come to the old man's hand with no impulse whatever to prove or reveal or complete, but only the plain pleasure of the watching, the pleasure a man takes in a fine thing that is none of his business, and needs nothing from him, and is complete without him, which is, Holmes was beginning to suspect, the only pleasure in the world that never fades, and the one he had gone his whole life without. The fine weather held. The valley lay still under its depthless blue. Far below, as the light went, the lamps of the town came. On one by one, and above them on the black shoulders of the mountains, there was nothing. Only the great cold shapes whose names Holmes knew now, standing where they had always stood, asking nothing, needing nothing, at peace. And Holmes stood at his window in the blue dusk and watched the lamps wake, as he had watched them his first night on the mountain, and found that the man watching them now was not quite the man who had watched them then, and did not entirely know when the change had happened, only that it had, the way the snow had thickened the air that first still morning, imperceptibly by degrees, until the whole world lay white and altered, and one could not say when it had begun. He didn't write to Mycroft that evening either. He had stopped by now, even intending to. The days that followed had for the first time no line running through them. Holmes noticed this as one notices the ending of a pain. Not the moment it stops, which is rarely felt, but some while later, when one realizes with surprise that it is gone and has been gone for some time. Through the early weeks of his season on the mountain there had always been a line. First the line of the light he was timing, then the line of the choffs and the old man, the puzzle laid straight across the loose morning that his mind could not help but run along. And now, having seen the whole of it and set it down, having made his silent choice and remade it each morning at the rail until the making of it grew easier, he found that the line had gone. The days did not point anywhere. They lay open, one after another, unstructured, unhurried, without a problem in them or the ghost of one. And Holmes moved through them at last the way the cure had always intended a man to move, which was to say hardly at all, and toward nothing, and with no thought of arriving. He still watched the old man feed the birds. That had not changed, and would not. The quarter of an hour at 8:30 remained the small, bright centre of his morning, the thing he looked forward to. But the watching had changed its whole character. Where before it had been a labour, the daily refusal, the door held shut, the remark formed and swallowed, it was now simply a pleasure, clean and unmixed, the pleasure of seeing a fine and finished thing done well by a man who loved the doing. The temptation to prove it, to speak it, to complete it, had not vanished all at once, but it had begun to fade exactly as Holmes had suspected it might, worn down morning by the small unfailing discipline of the withheld remark until there came a day, he could not afterward have said which, when he watched the crooked-tailed choff come down onto the old man's wrist and felt no impulse whatever to do anything about it, no itch, no ache, no reflex reaching for completion, only the broad, still pleasure of the watching itself. He had wanted, he realized, only to be able to watch a thing without needing to take it. He had never in his life been able to do that. He could do it now, and on the morning he first understood that he could, that the wanting was truly gone, spent, worn away, and that he might watch the old man and the birds for the whole rest of the winter, with nothing in his heart but a plain glad attention. He found that the understanding brought no triumph with it, no click of a thing achieved, but only a deepening of the peace he had first felt on the great still morning, as though a room in him that had been lit and busy his whole life had been allowed, finally, to go dim and hushed and be at rest. He lay in his blankets in the eastern glare and let the birds cry and the light come up the valley, and did not do one single thing about any of it, and was, in a way he could not have described to the man he had been a season before, and would only ever be able to describe to Watson, entirely content. The nights had changed too, and this was the change he prized above all the others, though he came to it last and understood it least. He slept now, not once, not as a fluke of a single exhausted night, but reliably, ordinarily as a matter of course. He lay down in his narrow bed with the stove ticking as it cooled and the great mountain dark pressing at the cracked window, and he slept, the whole night through, and woke to the shutters at 7 with no memory of the hours between but the plain physical fact of having rested, the lightness in the limbs, the clear unhurried mind. He, who had spent the better part of 2 decades treating sleep as an enemy to be outlasted, or a weakness to be chemically overruled, who had prowled the London nights because the nights would not have him, who had regarded his own exhausting wakefulness as somehow bound up with his gift, the price and proof of a mind too active to be stilled. He slept now, like a labourer, like a child, like a man with a clear conscience and nothing on his mind, and he could not for the life of him find the mechanism of it. He lay awake sometimes in the first minutes after the stove had gone still, and tried to. It was the one problem he permitted himself, and he pursued it gently without heat, as a man turns over a small puzzle at the edge of sleep. What had done it? Not the milk. The milk was absurd. Not the mountain air alone, though the air surely helped. Not the balcony, not the light, not the black bread, not any single item of the doctor's prescription. He came, over several such drowsy investigations, to a conclusion that would have astonished every physician at Davos, and that he never shared with any of them, that what had taught him to sleep was the old man and the birds and the withheld remark, that it was the daily practice of seeing a thing and not taking it, of holding a truth and not speaking it, of letting the world be full of things that were none of his business and needed nothing from him, that had somehow obscurely stilled the engine at last. For the engine had never truly stopped, in London, even in sleep. It had run on through the nights, gnawing, sorting, refusing to be still, because he had never once in his life given it permission to leave a thing alone. And here, morning by morning at the Eastern Rail, he had been teaching it precisely that some things might be left, unsolved, unspoken, whole, that the leaving of them was not a failure but a kind of grace. And the engine, taught this at last, had grown still enough some nights to let its owner sleep. It was, he reflected, drifting off on one such night with the stove ticking and the mountain dark at the glass, a very great deal to have learned from an old man and a flock of birds and a single remark never made. He supposed most men learned it younger, and more easily, and without needing to climb a mountain and lie in the cold for a season to do it. He supposed, too, that he would not have learned it at all had he not been stripped of everything else. The cases, the city, the work, the whole apparatus of his identity, and left with nothing to occupy the great engine but a widower and his birds. It had taken all of that. It had taken Reichenbach, and the false death, and the long strange exile, and the milk and the bread and the balcony, to bring the most reasoning man in England to the point of learning the one thing his reason had never been able to teach him, how to let a thing be. And he was not sorry for the cost. Lying in the dark on the edge of sleep, warm, the whole valley silent below him, he found he was not sorry for any of it, not even Reichenbach, if Reichenbach had been the price of this. And then the thought dissolved, as thoughts did now, gently, into the deep and ordinary sleep the mountain had given back to him, and he slept. The snow came off the roof in the small hours, sometimes in the thaws, a slow build of tension in the settled load above, a creak, a long tearing hush, and then the soft collapsing rush of it sliding free and dropping past the window into the dark, a sound Holmes had come to know so well that it no longer woke him, but only surfaced him for a moment, half conscious, into an awareness of where he was and how still it all was, before letting him sink again. He came to love that sound, the snow leaving the roof, the building shedding its weight in the night without any hand to help it, the way his own mind had learned to shed its weight, and he counted it, in the drowsy ledger he kept of the mountain's gifts, among the finest of them, to lie warm in the dark and hear the snow let go of the roof and slide away into the valley, and to need to do nothing about it, and to sleep. He wrote to Mycroft at last on a still afternoon near the end of the month, and the writing of it, when it finally came easily, and was nothing at all like what he had failed for 3 weeks to write. He had sat down to it twice before in the evenings by the stove, and found the page empty. Because he had been trying those times to render the mountain into information, into the clipped code his brother's mind would recognise, the report, the assessment, the account of progress towards some end. And there had been no information, and so there had been nothing to write. But on this still afternoon he sat down not to report but simply to speak, as a man speaks to a brother, and found that the page filled without effort. He did not tell Mycroft about the old man. That truth he kept, as he would keep it always, whole and unspoken, given back to the one it belonged to. It went into no letter and would go into none. But he told his brother in a few plain sentences that would have astonished anyone who knew the usual density of his correspondence, that he was well, that he was resting, which he'd found far harder than he had expected and was at last beginning to manage, that he had learned the names of the peaks, that he was sleeping through the night for the first time in more years than he cared to count, and that Mycroft was not to worry, and not to send for him, and not to expect much in the way of letters, because there was very little happening, and the very little that was happening was of a kind that did not go well into letters, and was better simply lived. He read it over. It was, he thought, the strangest thing he had ever sent his brother. A letter with no case in it, no request, no intelligence, no problem, nothing that Mycroft's vast machine of a mind could do anything with at all, only the bare, unremarkable news that Sherlock Holmes was well and resting and sleeping, and did not wish to be disturbed. And he found, sealing it, that he did not care in the least how Mycroft read it, whether with concern or approval, or the mild sardonic bafflement that was his brother's usual response to any behaviour of Holmes's that could not be accounted for by reason, because the letter was true, and it was his, and it gave away nothing he wished to keep, and that was all a letter needed to be. He gave it to Frau Brenner to send down with the afternoon post, and she took it, and glanced at the direction, and glanced at him, and said nothing, which was her way of saying a great deal. And the letter went down the mountain on the afternoon sledge with its successive bells, and that was the end of the 3 weeks' silence, and Holmes felt, watching the sledge go, none of the reluctance he had felt before, because he had not, in the end, given the mountain away. He had only told his brother he was well. The mountain he had kept. The other patients came and went about him in these last days of the month, and Holmes moved among them now, not as an observer, but very nearly as one of their number, which was a stranger transformation than any of the others, and the one he would have predicted least. He had arrived among them a watcher, a reader, a man apart by nature and profession, incapable of being in a room without dismantling everyone in it, and he found himself now, at the month's end, simply a guest at the sanatorium above Davos, one convalescent among a dozen, who nodded to the Colonel and was nodded to, who raised his hat to the Miss Fanshaws on the afternoon path, who had come to a wordless understanding with Herr Vogt, by which the two of them, the Englishman and the German, acknowledged across the balcony each morning a shared and unspoken amusement at the whole business of taking the cure, and who left the melancholy Russian alone always, and was easy in the leaving of it. He still read them, of course. He could not read them. The eye did not close, the machinery did not switch off, and he knew more about every soul in that dining room than any of them would have believed possible or comfortable. But the reading had come loose from the using, and then from the caring, and had settled at last into something almost like affection. For he found that when a man reads another completely, and does nothing whatever with what he reads, neither uses it, nor judges it, nor even, in the end, particularly minds it, what is left when the using and the judging fall away is very close to tenderness. He knew the Colonel for a lonely, frightened, kindly old fraud, whose forecasts were a way of imposing a small daily order on a world that had grown too large and too uncertain for him, and he did not despise the Colonel for it, or even find him absurd any longer, but felt for him something warm and unlooked for that he could only call fondness. He knew the Miss Fanshaw's whole gentle, desperate campaign, and hoped, actually hoped, plainly and without irony, that Miss Cecily would be spoken for before the season ended, and that Miss Augusta might set down at last the long weariness of her watching. He knew Herr Vogt would learn in time that health came unbidden or not at all, and he wished the young man an easy learning of it. He knew the Russian's grief was beyond any touch, and he honoured it by leaving it be. He had come to the mountain the most detached man in England, and the mountain had taught him, by way of an old man and some birds, the one thing detachment had always cost him, which was the plain, warm, ordinary business of caring about the people in the room without needing anything from them at all. And Herr Adler he watched each morning, and knew entirely, and loved. There was no smaller word for it, though Holmes would have flinched from the word had anyone offered it to him, and never once by the smallest sign let it show. The old man remained to the end entirely unaware that he had been seen. He came out at 8:20 each morning in his good old coat, and broke his white roll and fed the birds from his open hand, and showed them his empty palms when the bread was gone, and went back to his chair, courteous and solitary and whole. And he had no idea in all the world, that a few chairs off there lay a man who had reconstructed the entire private architecture of his heart, and had chosen, morning after morning, out of something Holmes was only now learning to call by its right name, to leave that architecture standing, untouched, unspoken, exactly as the old man had built it. It was the finest thing Holmes had ever done, and no one would ever know he had done it, least of all the man for whom it was done. And Holmes found, examining this, that the secrecy of it did not trouble him in the least, that in fact the secrecy was the whole point, that a kindness known is a kindness diminished, and that the purest form of the thing is the one performed in perfect silence, for no credit, seen by no one, and carried afterward alone. He had spent his life doing difficult things for the applause of the doing. He did this one for no applause at all, and it was the best of them. The month turned. The fine still weather that had held for days finally broke gently into a spell of soft grey falls of snow that muffled the whole valley and hushed the pines, and lay along the balcony rail in fresh unmarked drifts each morning. And the Colonel forecast an end to the snow with such confidence that Holmes knew it would go on falling, and it did, softly, for the better part of a week. And Holmes lay through that week wrapped in his blankets on the balcony, in the soft grey falling hush, and watched the old man feed the birds through the drifting snow, and slept through the nights, and did nothing, and wanted nothing, and was. The word came to him one grey morning unbidden, and he did not argue with it. Happy. He had not expected to be happy. He had come to the mountain to rest, which he had understood as a kind of maintenance, a repair, a grim necessary halt before the resumption of the real business of his life. And he had discovered, without ever setting out to discover it, that the halt was not a halt at all, but a place, a way of being, that a man might inhabit and be whole in, and that the real business of his life, the cases and the city and the great engine running, was perhaps not the whole of what he was for after all, or not the best of it. He did not know yet what he would do with this discovery. He would go back, in time, he knew that. England and Watson and the work were waiting, and there were matters still to be settled that only he could settle, and the false death could not last forever. He would go back to all of it. But he would go back changed, carrying the mountain in him, carrying the old man and the birds and the withheld remark, carrying the knowledge that he had learned to sleep, and to let a thing be, and to care about a room full of people without needing to take anything from them. And he thought, lying in the soft grey falling snow, that whatever cases came to him afterward, however the great engine ran again in the years ahead, some part of him would remain always here, on this balcony, above this valley, watching an old man feed the birds and choosing, forever, to say nothing. The stove ticked in his room that night as it cooled, and the snow slid off the roof in the small hours in its long soft rush, and Holmes surfaced for a moment into the warm dark and heard it go, and knew where he was, and how still it all was, and how little there was that needed doing, and sank again easily into the deep and ordinary sleep the mountain had given him, and slept until the shutters folded back at 7, upon another grey and gentle morning, and the milk, and the black bread, and the long unhurried day, and the birds that would come, as they always came, to the one man who was always there to meet them. There was nothing left to solve. There had never really been anything to solve. And Holmes, waking to the shutters and the flat grey light, understood this at last not as a disappointment, but as the whole strange gift of the season, that he had come to a place where his greatest faculty was of no use whatever, and had found, in the uselessness of it, a peace his usefulness had never once brought him. That the finest hours of his winter had been the ones in which he did nothing, saw a truth, and gave it back unspoken. And that a man might, if he were very fortunate and had climbed high enough and lain still long enough in the cold, learn the one thing that all his cleverness had never taught him, which was how to leave the world alone and be left alone by it, and rest. He rose and dressed and went down to the milk and the bread. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the snow fell soft and grey and steady on the valley, and somewhere along the balcony the attendants were carrying out the long chairs for another day of the cure, and in a little while, at 8:20, an old man in a good old coat would come out into the falling snow with a fresh white roll, and take up his station at the rail and wait for the birds. Holmes would be there, a few chairs off, to watch him. He would say nothing. He had learned how. The season ended as all his seasons on the mountain ended, which is to say without event, in the ordinary turning of one grey day into the next, until a morning came when the light had a different quality in it, a thinness that spoke of the spring still weeks away but no longer unimaginable. And Holmes understood that his winter was drawing toward its close. He was not yet to leave. There were weeks in it still. But he felt the turn, the way he had learned to feel all the mountain's turns, and he stood at his window in the blue dusk of that evening and watched the lamps come on in the valley below one at a time, spreading along the invisible line of the single street, and he thought that he had watched them do this on his first night here, months ago, as a stranger and a tired man who did not know how the thing called rest was done, and that the man watching them now had learned. The valley filled with the deep Alpine blue that was not quite any colour a London evening ever managed, the snow still faintly luminous inside it, holding the last of the light long after the sky above the peaks had let it go. The lamps woke below, small and yellow and patient. Above them, on the black shoulders of the mountains whose names he knew now, everyone, there was nothing at all, no lamp, no glow, no smallest human spark, only the great cold shapes standing where they had always stood, asking nothing, needing nothing, at rest. And Holmes stood among the two darknesses, the lit one below and the unlit one above, and was at peace in a way he could not have imagined on the night he arrived, and knew that in the morning, at 8:20, the old man would come out to the rail with a fresh white roll, and the birds would come down out of the cold to meet him, and Holmes would be there, a few chairs off, to watch, and would say nothing, and that this was exactly as it should be, and would go on being so for whatever remained of the winter, and that he asked for nothing more. He did not solve anything that evening. There was nothing to solve. There had never, in the whole long season, been anything to solve. No crime, no cipher, no client at the door in the small hours, no body on any hearthrug, only an old man and a flock of birds, and a truth seen and kept, and a tired mind learning at last to be still. It was the emptiest case of his life, and the one that had changed him most, and the only one he ever asked me not to write. And here I must set down my pencil, for that is the whole of it, and there is nothing further to tell. He came back to us, in time, as the world knows. He came down off his mountain and out of his false death, and back into the noise and fog of London, and the long roll of cases that filled the years that followed, and the man who came back was, to any eye but mine, the same man who had gone away. But I who had known him longest saw the difference, though I could not for years have named it, and did not learn its source until the night by our own fire when he told me, almost by accident, of the winter above Davos, and the old Austrian, and the Choffs, and the remark he had formed and never made. He told it plainly, without any of his usual relish for a story, and when he had finished he sat looking into the fire for a long while, and then he said, and it is the only reason I have set any of this down, that of all the things he had ever deduced in his life, the old man and the birds was the one he was proudest of, because it was the one he had solved completely and then chosen, alone, and for no reward, and known by no one, to leave forever unspoken. I asked him, greatly daring, whether he did not sometimes wish he had said something to the old gentleman, some small kind word that the two of them might have understood one another before the end. And Holmes was silent a moment, and the fire settled, and the wind worked at the chimney, and then he said no, that he did not, that he had understood the old man well enough for both of them, and that the truest kindness he had ever done anyone in his life was the one that left no trace at all, a thing seen entire and given back whole and never named. And then he said nothing more, and neither did I, and after a while he took up his pipe, and I my book, and the fire burned low, and the night went on, and we sat together in the warm room in perfect and companionable silence, two old friends with nothing left to say and no need to say it, keeping quiet company across the small distance of the hearth. And that, I think, was the last of what the mountain gave him, and the best, not the sleep, though he slept better ever after, not the rest, though he was never again quite so driven a man as he had been. But this, the knowledge, carried home from a balcony above a valley in the snow, that some things are more truly kept than told, and that the finest hours of a life may be the still ones in which nothing whatever is solved. Sleep now, wherever you are listening from tonight. There is no mystery here, and nothing left to unravel, only the lamps coming on in the valley one by one, and the snow settling soft on the pines, and an old man who will rise in the morning to feed the birds and be, in the one way that matters, expected. Only the blue dusk, and the great still peaks, and the warm room and the low fire, and the long ordinary blessed quiet of a night with nothing in it that needs doing. Rest well, breathe slow, and let the day's thoughts go, one at a time, like lamps going out in a valley far below, until there is only the dark and the snow and sleep.